So as I mentioned, my name is Cinnamon Porter, and I am the mission educator for the YWCA McLean County. And before we start this conversation, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. So what I first want to ask of you all is, this is a conversation, a dialogue, and so I want you all to be present. That being said, if you feel comfortable, you can go ahead and turn on your cameras. It's nice to see other folks. And then when you turn on your cameras, just be mindful of muting yourself or unmuting yourself. But please, if at any point you have a question or you want to add something to the discussion, you can unmute yourself, as well as there is a raise hand feature. So that is another way to let me know that you want to add something to the conversation. And then you can also post any questions or comments in the chat box, and I will check that periodically as we go through. So the community agreements that I have for us starting off is for everyone to be present. This webinar will only last 1 hour, so I know some people are feeling Zoom fatigued, but I would appreciate everyone being present for this webinar. I love participation and I want to interact with you all, and I hope that's something that you all want to as well. So please engage as much as you want. The next agreement would be active listening. So listening to understand and to learn. And then on to the next one is open and honest communication. So please engage, please listen to learn and chime in, but make sure that we are respectful when we do a chime in. And then embrace discomfort. So some of the things that we might talk about or someone might bring up might make you feel a certain way, might make you feel uncomfortable. You might not agree, and that's okay. Discomfort is a part of the learning process. So embrace that discomfort. That allows us room to grow. So I'm going to ask you all if we can all agree on these community agreements, as well as are there any other expectations that you all have for this presentation? And again, you can just unmute yourself and chime in. All right. Give me one moment here. I'm having some trouble pulling up the chat box. Here we go. Okay. All right, so it looks like everyone agrees. So we're gonna go ahead and move forward here. So let's start with a definition of the school to prison pipeline. We've got two words that we know what they mean, right? We've got the school system, and then we have the prison system. So when we talk about a pipeline, we're talking about children who are being funneled out of the school system and then being pushed into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. When this happens, it disproportionately affects students who are marginalized. And the communities that we see mostly or disproportionately impacted by the school to prison pipeline are students with disabilities, students of color, and then the LGBTQ students. This school to prison pipeline is also connected to our mass incarceration in the United States. So some quick facts about mass incarceration, because that could be a whole nother presentation that we do. But the US currently locks up more people per capita than any other nation in the world. So the US imprisons folks more often than any other nation in the world. And so currently there are over 2.3 million people incarcerated at any given point. In addition to that, most folks who are incarcerated are pre-trial. And what that means is they have been arrested, but they have not yet been convicted of a crime. So they're still waiting to get to see if they are innocent or guilty to be sentenced, things like that. In addition to that, of the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated currently, over 40,000 of those are youth. And so that's what we're gonna focus on today, is how this mass incarceration affects our youth and how does that even start. And a lot of these offenses are low-level offenses like parole violations, misdemeanors for jaywalking, traffic stops, but those add up and those build up, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what I'm gonna do is show us a couple of graphics that will help us break down and understand what mass incarceration looks like, and then we're gonna hone into the school to prison pipeline. So if we look at this first image here, this is from the Prison Policy Initiative. It shows us a pie chart. So 2.3 million people, and it breaks down how those 2.3 million people are confined nationwide. So it shows in the light blue color, 1.2, almost 1.3 million people are in state prisons, and it breaks down why they're there. You've got 631,000 people who are in local jails. And then it shows federal prisons and jails, and you have about 226,000 people there. But if we look to the right side of the graphic, that first section shows that 44,000 youth are currently incarcerated right now. And we're gonna start to break that down with some other images. But I wanted to give you all a moment to look at this image, take it in, because it does play a part into what we're gonna be talking about later. So I'll give you all a moment just to look at this graphic.
Are you going to explain the different types of incarceration places? I'm confused about territorial prisons and involuntary commitment.
Yes, so I saw you in another question about, does this include funneling for alternative schools? Yes, it does. And it is interesting, and I would encourage you all to look up the different types of ways that people are incarcerated, because as you mentioned, yeah, there's terms like territorial prisons and involuntary confinement, and even immigration detention is included uh, in these statistics. Um, so please feel free to research those things. Um, the involuntary commitments, I couldn't give you a good definition of. Um, but then the territorial prisons, I know that some, well, yeah, back to the same thing. It's like I have kind of a small understanding, but not the greatest of understanding. So maybe at the end when we get to questions and comments, I could kind of look it up and try to help us answer that question. But that is a good one. But yes, these, when we get to the youth statistics, it does include funneling from the alternative schools. So we're gonna go to our next slide. So that's looking at the prison system overall. Now this one is specifically focused on the youth. So it says every day over 48,000 youth are held in facilities as a part of the juvenile or criminal justice system. So we see kids are being held in detention centers, long-term secure facilities, adult prisons and jails, residential treatment groups home, and then it also breaks down some other places as well. But all of these numbers are considered a part of the incarceration system. So I'll give you another moment to look at some of these breakdowns. And as I said before, these come from the Prison Policy Initiative. So you all can log on. It's prisonpolicy.org. And it has these graphics and articles and information that are easy to read and understand. And that would be helpful for you all to further your understanding of this in this conversation. And I'll go ahead and post that in the chat as well. Now, focusing in even further about the school to prison pipeline, and we're going to tie all of these things in, is the youth that are in juvenile facilities and by their age. So we said anywhere from 44 to 48,000 youth are currently incarcerated. So starting with 12 or younger, you have almost 550 children who are currently incarcerated. 13, we've got 1,429. And as they get a little bit older, it keeps growing. So by the time they're 14, that number doubles. By the time children are 16 and 17, we're up to 11,000, 12,000 children who are incarcerated. Another interesting point is to add, if you see the second statement there, it says another 4,671 youths ages 17 and younger were held in adult prisons or adult jails. So they're not even in juvenile facilities, but they're being held in adult facilities, which is definitely a point for concern. And what I want to do is ask you all a question, which is, when you see how many people are affected by the criminal justice system, incarceration, and not just people, but youth, what feelings or what thoughts come to mind? Because when I see these numbers, I have this feeling of, wow, there is probably, you know, a better way to work with youth, right? They're just kids. And you know, maybe incarceration isn't the best way to give these kids what they need. But what feelings or thoughts come to you when you see these numbers?
I mean, for me, it is a lack of surprise, which is disheartening that we have now become accustomed to this kind of injustice. But also, I see it as the call to us needing to do more work because we can't continue the numbers at the way they look now.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Is there anyone else who would like to share? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I usually have questions like where do they live? When they're younger individuals, a lot of the assumptions that I make will be based on, I just assume that the juveniles are in urban areas and are gang related. And so I make the assumption that because of the environment that a lot of the youth are in, there's initiations required, and these are the students who get caught. Another thing I think about is the instability of their home environment. And if they can't feel, if these kids don't feel comfortable in their own homes, where are they going to find some sort of security? They're going to find it outside of their home, or they're going to rely on media. And if media is constantly throwing these negative, this is not a simple solution, by the way. There's so many different things that can affect why students act the way they do. And I call them students. I mean, maybe I shouldn't even assume that they're all going to school. Maybe they're being held at home. Maybe they're being kept at home and not allowed to interact with other students. I don't know a lot of the statistics behind these numbers. So I guess that's really where my questions and my assumptions are coming from.
Yeah, and I think it's good for us to unpack, yeah, how does this happen? And we're gonna look at that. Also, who this is most likely to affect. And at the same time, though, we'll see that, and as I mentioned before, it is students of color, students with disabilities, but they are being disproportionately affected by this. But I agree that there is no one simple answer, but there is information and research out there that shows us what are our alternatives, and we will end with that. What are some solutions? How can we shift from what's currently happening? So the first part of the school to prison pipeline is zero tolerance policies. If you all are familiar with the education system, even in the slightest, you are probably aware of these zero tolerance policies. So what they do is they criminalize minor infractions of school rules. So what used to be, you know, hey, you were talking back in class, or, you know, you were being disruptive in class, you need to go to the principal's office or sit out in the hallway, or you get a detention, now is met with a school resource officer. And we'll talk about that later. But basically that means instead of just getting a detention or sitting outside, now you are interacting with a law enforcement officer, and they're there to discipline that student. Another part of these zero tolerance policies is broken window policing or policies. And so this isn't only true to the school system, but it is also true to our community. So it exists inside of the school system and outside of it. But basically, the goal of broken windows policing is to crack down on smaller issues to theoretically prevent more serious issues from occurring. So an example would be, hey, if I, crack down, so this would be outside of the community. Hey, if I crack down on people, traffic citations, right? If I pull over a lot of people, then I will be able to prevent larger issues from occurring. Or in schools, it is, hey, if I am basically over policing, then I will stop larger issues from occurring. And so what we see is that over policing happens to marginalized students. And we'll talk about some statistics in a bit. But what ends up happening is that kids and students are getting suspensions for talking back, skipping class, or any disruptive behavior. And disruptive is a very loose term. People can define it how they want to. And we'll talk about that with the last point. But I think about when I was in, junior high, high school, kind of the class clown, right? And okay, so I got in trouble for talking too much in class. What did I get? I had to sit outside in the hallway, or I got a detention. I can't imagine, just being a child, and instead of, having the teacher talk to me or any other courses that could be taken, I now have to interact with a law enforcement officer. And so I want you all to reflect for a moment. What were you like when you were growing up in grade school, junior high, high school? What kind of, what kind of little trouble did you all get into? And then what were the consequences for that? And if anyone wants to share, please feel free. Is there anyone that wants to share about, what, and it's just kid play, right? But what kind of stuff happened, and what were the consequences? Because we're going to talk about the difference of the consequences from before and how it's shifted to now into 2020. You all were just good kids, huh? All right, I'll trust and believe you.
Well, I had to stand in the corner for talking too much, but that was about, oh no, I had in-school suspension for skipping class in middle school. So I had to clean the cafeteria while my friends were at lunch.
Right, and that seems like a reasonable thing, right? But we'll talk, and I'll show some examples in a minute here, but that's, kind of typical consequence of having to stay in from recess, or, staying after school to help clean, has now been elevated to a level where kids are having to interact with law enforcement, which, and we'll show in a minute, means that kids, the youth students, are getting criminal records at 9, 10, 11, 12. And again, we're gonna focus on some solutions at the end. But one other interesting thing is these school disturbance laws. So currently 20 states still have them. A lot of states have gotten rid of them. But basically what a school disturbance law is, is it allows for if a student is disturbing school, and again, there is no definition of what disturbing means. The school and law enforcement can discipline and punish a child, and there is no boundaries for what that consequence could be. So it could be anything from you're talking too much in class. Well, that's disturbing our school, right? So now law enforcement can come in here and give you a consequence, and they don't have a limit to that consequence. So a lot more states used to have it, but it seems to be on the decline, which I think is a positive thing, and we'll talk about a little bit why. But just an interesting fact that still 20 states have this. So moving on to school resource officers, many schools have what they call school resource officers. And what they are, and this is a definition that comes from the National Association of School Resource Officers. Their definition of a school resource officer is a career law enforcement with sworn authority who is deployed by an employing police agency or department, and they are to work with one or more schools. So these school resource officers are sworn law enforcement. They are career law enforcement, and then they get deployed into one or more schools. As I was reading through, there's some like frequently asked questions, and one that I was curious about was, are these school resource officers allowed to carry firearms? And the answer was yes. So all school resource officers are armed with firearms.
May I ask, I'm going to ask a question. Since this is, I have two questions actually. So the school resource officers, this is beyond DARE officers, is that correct?
I don't know what a DARE officer would be. Do you mind sharing?
Okay, so I'm showing my age now. DARE
I know
officers.
What DARE is. Yeah.
Yeah, they were, shortly after I graduated high school, DARE officers came in with the sole purpose of trying to deter youth from going into drug use and to, I think, establish a good PR between students and police departments.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my first question, to verify that this is beyond DARE. And since this is the 1990s, that's when Columbine happened. So I'm thinking the school resource officer is a result of trying to prevent school shootings, and unfortunately the backlash is more and more schools are becoming less tolerant of anything that could blow up to be criminal behavior. Am I on the right track here? Because I am not a law enforcement person. I guess I should probably say this too. A lot of the words that you're using and a lot of the phrases are very new to me, because I'm a part-time math instructor. And so I'm kind of interested in, you know, how this might affect what I might be seeing. So, okay, I'll quiet down now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that's my first bullet point, is that the school resource officers became mainstream in the 1990s. And that was as a result of concern over mass shootings, as you mentioned, and drug abuse and juvenile crime. And so what ended up happening was federal and state officials offered local districts money to hire officers and then purchase equipment like metal detectors, the wands, things like that. So you're absolutely right that it was a result of that. But something that I was going to mention later is there are a lot of studies and research that has shown that officers being in the schools, there is very little connection to them reducing mass shootings. And so, again, thinking about solutions, like how do we get there, right? When we think about Columbine, what if there was more psychologists or social workers or things of that nature? Not to say that that would have prevented what happened, but that is something for us to think about, is what are some other alternatives that we have instead of using law enforcement? Let's take a look here. So children are turned over to criminal justice system as a form of punishment. So again, you skipped out on class, you know, now the person who's going to give the discipline or the consequence is going to be a law enforcement officer. And so let's say you have your first offense, you skip class one day, and you have to do community service, right? So instead of the issue being handled within the school, it's now moved into law enforcement's hand, and what they say is now you have to do community service. Okay. But now that you have that first tally mark, you know, on your scorecard, if you were to have a second offense, so let's say you skip class again, the second punishment is going to be harsher, right? And the more of these that we rack up, the harsher the punishment will be. And so again, it's taking the discipline and consequences from outside of the school system and moving it into the hands of law enforcement, which leads students to having their first contact with the criminal justice systems, which means that minors are having criminal records. And that follows kids. Sometimes those things can be sealed, or they might be erased off their record once they become adults, but it still has an overwhelming impact on the child itself. So there was a study done in 2018, and they were looking back at the 2013-2014 school year, but that 2/3 of high school students attended a school with a police officer. So that's a lot of high schools. And then 45% of middle schoolers attended a school with a school resource officer, and then 20% of elementary students. But overwhelmingly, high school and junior high school students have school resource officers in their building. And I know that to be true here locally in McLean County, that a lot of these schools have school resource officers. And not only do a lot of students in general have school resource officers, but a majority of schools that have a high population of Black and Brown students have more school resource officers than schools that serve mostly white students. The other thing about school resource officers are they are trained to, you know, be police officers, law enforcement. That's what they do. They are not trained to work with youth. On the National Association for School Resource Officers, they did say that they view themselves as more as educators and counselors, but that's one side, and people have experienced a different side as well. What I do want to show is 2 short clips of incidents that have occurred recently with school resource officers. And I will give a warning that it does have physical violence. So if you're not comfortable with that, you can look away, and I'll tell you when we move on to our next slide. But unfortunately, when we have these school resource officers in our schools, they are the ones playing the role of, providing consequences and discipline. It does incite some violence. So I'm going to switch over to these videos real quick. So this first one is from 2015. And I remember this one very clearly, and I think some of you may remember it as well. But a student in South Carolina was texting on her phone. The teacher said, "Stop texting." She says no. And who gets called is a school resource officer. And this is what happens through the interaction.
Hands behind your back. Give me your hands. Give me your hands.
So I'll show that one more time because it's a short clip.
Hands behind your back. Give me your hands. Give me your hands.
So I will ask you all, what did you see? Because I have a feeling about what I saw, but what did you all see happen there?
I don't think your video went to
Right.
everyone. So we didn't see the video. We just see your PowerPoint screen.
Got you. All right. We'll
Try it again.
All right. Give me 1 second here. Okay. You can see the New York Times.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So we'll watch it again.
Hands behind your back. Give me your hands. Give me your hands. Hands behind your back. Give me your hands. Give me your hands.
Okay, so I'll re-ask that question. What did you all see in that video, and what feelings does it prompt for you?
I see someone overpowering a young person. And of course, we only see the action of that, not anything that happens before that. But it's very startling for the people around too, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see the person that's at the desk behind them be startled by what happens as that desk is flipped over. And what we later learned from this incident is that that girl and then the person who recorded the video were both suspended, which is, I think, interesting to say the least, that someone who is documenting what is happening is suspended by the school for just capturing what is going on.
The cynic in me thinks that the reason that, well, there are a couple of reasons that The biggest reason I think that student who recorded this was suspended is there's probably a no tolerance policy for using your cell phone in class, which was probably the workaround to get that document, the person who documented it, out on suspension.
Yeah, and
Just-
you know what, you're probably right.
Oh my
I see Charles has their hand raised. Go ahead, Charles.
I think in addition to even the incident, and I'm very familiar with this video, it introduces trauma into the classroom. So over the last 2 to 3 years, I've interviewed about 200 students and parents, African-American students and parents throughout Michigan and Illinois on their understanding and perceptions of school suspensions. And what children are saying, among other things, is that when incidents like this happen in their classrooms, they are afraid to come to school. You know, they don't want to be searched or aggressively sort of manhandled by school guards. And as a student who has endured this, you know, how do you come back to school the next day and see that guard? Everybody in that class, how do you ever confront that guard again? So it becomes an issue of, I don't want to go to school, but I can't stay home. So this is how a lot of kids find themselves in the street.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about the impacts that this trauma, as you mentioned, affects the students. And we're talking about dropout rates and what that, again, what kind of path does that lead these students on? I've got one more to show you, 2015. And there's one that's more recent from November of last year. So this video is of an 11-year-old boy, and he is being, we're not sure if he's being escorted from class, but a school resource officer is walking with him down the hallway.
In this surveillance video inside a middle school hallway in Vance County, North Carolina, you can see a child in a red sweatshirt walking down the hallway with a school resource officer. The next part can be very hard to watch. The school resource officer is seen grabbing and slamming the child to the ground. Then he picks up the child and does it again before yanking the student up and continuing down the hall.
I was stunned. I was shocked.
Sheriff Curtis Brame told CNN affiliate WRAL this surveillance video inside a middle school hallway in Vance County, North Carolina, you can see a child in a red sweatshirt walking down the hallway with a school resource officer. The next part can be very hard to watch. The school resource officer is seen grabbing and slamming the child to the ground. Then he picks up the child and does it again before yanking the student up and continuing down the hall.
So again, asking you all, what did you all see in that video?
At least for me, that one was more shocking than the first one. I think maybe because it was a smaller child and it seemed that he just, I don't know if he was lost consciousness or not, but it looked like just flipping a rag doll around.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
You know, when I see clips like this, I think about the power dynamics that are situated against the student. If this incident wasn't on video, would the student even feel comfortable telling anybody that this ever happened? And how many times has this happened and it wasn't on video? And when the student goes to, even make a complaint, you are up against the school resource officer, the educators, the principal. The entire sort of school is stacked against the student. And I've been really thinking about this as well. Should school discipline issues, be handled by school staff, or should we have a third party sort of neutral individual that's sort of outside the school district handle these kind of issues because of how often, we get them wrong because so many things are stacked against the student.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And so, Charles, as you mentioned, these were 2 incidents that were recorded, but it happens more often that it is caught on camera. And so I know for both the first and second video that we watched, both officers were paid or put on paid leave. And I know for sure the second officer, they go on in the video to explain that the officer never had any incidents before. But again, as you mentioned, that power dynamic, and would students feel comfortable coming forward about an incident that they've experienced? So looking at some other statistics, we talked about how marginalized students are more likely to be affected by the school to prison pipeline. So a couple statistics here that come from the ACLU. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled versus their white counterparts. Black students make up 16% of student enrollment, but 31% of in-school arrest. So that means they are, twice as likely, and it goes back to that broken windows policing, to experience an in-school arrest. And then the last one is students with disabilities are 2 times more likely to get an out-of-school suspension. So take a minute to soak that in. And my next question is, what kind of impact do you think these statistics and what we've talked about thus far, any interactions that these students are having with law enforcement, the out-of-school suspensions, students are likely to be held back or drop out? What kind of impact will this have on students currently and then moving forward? My next slide has a couple of answers to that question, but I wanted to see if y'all wanted to take a guess and what's your feelings about it.
Okay, as usual, I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a couple questions. So this is a nationwide study that the
Yes.
ACLU did. Okay, so the next question I have is, how much of this is based on the systemic racism that has occurred trying to deny, especially in the northern school districts, trying to deny true integration?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question that I don't have a perfect answer to, but the fact is it's not just the school to prison pipeline, but it's also taking a look at the larger systems of oppression, including racism, and what impact does that have? Because even in school districts that have majority marginalized students, their teachers and their administrators don't look like them and may not be able to empathize with the student's situation. And so that leads to, racial bias, implicit bias, and then how does that play out? Instead of the teacher handling it themselves, they're calling in the school resource officer. That's kind of the short answer, but I think you're on the right path with that question.
I think that's a very interesting question. If you're familiar with the Brown v. Board of Education, so that's the court decision that reintegrated or racially integrated public schools and sort of banned racial segregation in public schools. We know that happened in 1954, and immediately after schools are racially integrated, you see these instances of school to prison pipeline. So the first study to document the school to prison pipeline was conducted by the Children's Defense Fund in 1974. So immediately afterwards, and you're on the right track, Mary, right after, racial integration in schools is sort of legalized. And keep in mind that we had to, to send U.S. Marshals to kind of enforce these things. So even though Brown v. Board was authorized and passed in 1954, it took 15 years for it even to come into fruition. And then you have the school to prison pipeline show up immediately after. So it's definitely an attempt to sort of maintain racial segregation in public schools. And what we know about the school to prison pipeline is it's actually worse in the South. So it's not just the northern states, it's a national phenomenon, and it's actually, the racial disparities are actually much greater in the South and amongst girls too.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that, Charles, because I have a slide on resources, and one of them focuses on Black girls and the rates that they are being pushed out of schools disproportionately, and there's not too much talk about that. So looking at impact, and I mean, these are just a couple of impacts that the school to prison pipeline has on our children. But when students are being expelled or they're getting suspensions, they're losing class time, which means that they're less likely to complete schoolwork and then more likely to skip class. As well as if you are not completing schoolwork, what does that mean? You're gonna be held out or you're just gonna drop out. Students of color are more likely then to be held back or to drop out. And 60%, so the dropout rate increases your chance of being arrested by 3 times. So if you drop out in high school, you are 3 times more likely to then be arrested within 1 year. And so again, that's just starting a cycle. And if you are, if you have interactions with law enforcement as a minor, you are 67% more likely to spend time in jail again before you are 25. So once you have that one interaction, the likelihood of you having another interaction with law enforcement greatly increases. Students who do not complete high school make less money. So if you do not have a high school diploma, you are less likely to make more money, and they are also a part of the highest rate of employment. So if you don't have a high school diploma, you are in the highest rate to be unemployed and to have the lowest median income. So it's like a double-edged sword there. Students who are not in class are more likely to engage in risky behavior. Again, if you're not in school, like, and you're a kid, what would you be spending your time doing? And then the last one's suspension and expulsion lead to a negative school environment. And so it affects not just that one student, but it affects the entire student body. And when a student is expelled or suspended, they tend to feel less safe. Other students tend to feel less safe and then are less likely to bond with teachers and other staff. And then students are less likely to get along with each other. So it has a ripple effect. Yeah. So there is some pushback about trying to get school resource officers pulled out of schools. You have resistance from police officers themselves because those are the folks who are these school resource officers. And again, the National Association said that these officers are more educators and counselors. But that means that we're spending time and money to train these police officers, not just to work with youth, but to become educators and counselors. And so we'll talk about some solutions, but one of them is to then instead employ more social workers and therapists and counselors in these schools, right? These are people with master's degrees, and this is their only job and focus. And then some parents and school officials think that if we take school resource officers out of schools, that this would leave schools more vulnerable to violence. But there was a report from the Congressional Research Service, and it concluded that there was very little connection between the presence of a school resource officer and then the change in crime at a school. So having a school resource officer doesn't really reduce any crime or violence that is happening at a school. So you might ask, Cinnamon, okay, if we don't have these school resource officers, what are we gonna do instead? Well, the big goal is to end mass incarceration, and there's a lot of steps there. And I posted in the chat the prisonpolicy.org. I would recommend that you all check out that website because they've got a lot of good information about mass incarceration, different studies, different research. So what we need to do is remove these resource officers, and instead we need to address inadequate resources for our schools, right? Because these officers are trying to be disciplinaries, they're trying to be social workers, they're trying to be a lot of different things. But what we need to do instead is to fund our schools, provide more social workers, provide smaller classroom sizes, which provides better connection between teachers and staff and the students that are there, which decreases the likelihood of negative interaction between the two groups. Eliminate policies like No Child Left Behind. And what No Child Left Behind does, and some other incentives, is say, if you are not reaching certain benchmarks, then we are going to take away funding. And so what we need to do is to flip that. Hey, you're not meeting these benchmarks. Let's instead give you more funding so that we can better help you. Because what it does is if you take away resources from schools who are not already meeting benchmarks, then it pushes out students, right? It makes them more likely to drop out from schools. And then also, it feels like a hot topic pretty recently, but this concept of restorative justice. So instead of calling the school resource officer, let's sit down the teacher, the student, and the other student who's having an issue. Or we need to come together and try to process and talk about what is the issue, what is the harm that's being caused, and find a solution to try to fix that. Instead of just sending kids out of school, trying to just talk through it and work together. Question, well, actually, let me go on to these resources and then I'll take a minute for questions. All right, so some resources this is the book that I mentioned earlier. It's called Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris. That is a great one. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And so that focuses more on that school to prison pipeline. But if you're trying to get a good understanding of mass incarceration in general, I would recommend The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And also The 13th, which is a documentary that you can view on Netflix. But definitely check out those two books. And then some organizations that are on the forefront of this school to prison pipeline issue is the ACLU, so the American Civil Liberties Union, Dignities in Schools, as well as that website that I posted earlier, the Prison Policy Institute. I realize it's a couple minutes after 3:03, but just my last slide is to see if anyone has any questions or anything else that you all would like to add or to share or ask.
I have one thing I would like to add. I think in terms of solutions to the school to prison pipeline, I think two things. First, we have to evaluate each situation and even ask ourselves, what suspension even necessary? In the students that I have interviewed, many times they were suspended due to a sort of misinterpretation of the incident or sort of perceived criminalization of their behavior. And they were never given an opportunity to explain their side. They were just, told, you're being suspended, here's your slip, goodbye. And I think that's problematic because the students never get an opportunity to tell their side. And many of them suggested that if this school actually gave them an opportunity to voice their opinion and tell their perspective, they would have never been suspended in the first place because no infraction had ever occurred. The second solution, I think that, especially here in Illinois, you have Senate Bill 100 that was passed in 2015 to reduce suspension rates by mandating that schools consider a variety of factors, the student's age, their disability, the severity of the offense before a suspension was ever implemented. And what I found, even in my study, is that schools aren't using it. Many schools, and particularly school principals, have the attitude that there's no enforcement of the bill. So we've been suspending kids for 30, 40 years. And it's an attitude and a sort of tool that's been ingrained so deeply into our school systems that many principals just feel like this is what we're going to do. The bill doesn't penalize me for violating it. And, nobody's going to stop me. And that's the problem. And I've actually talked to the legislature about that as well, because it's not just here in Illinois, this is in Michigan as well. There's a really staunch resistance to school discipline reform.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And one other solution that I forgot to mention, excuse me, is to move conversations within our own communities. Because you're absolutely right. If schools don't have enforcement, no one's checking up on them, from the state, from the federal government, whatever, who is looking in on that? And that's our role as community members, is to be asking those questions and to make sure that our schools are the best for our community, right? So that's a stake that we have as community members, even if we don't have kids in the school system or, we're not working for a school system. Outside of that, as community members, we have a stake in making sure that, we are searching for alternative solutions. So I just have one more slide, which is just my contact information. I appreciate you all coming on this call. And if you have more follow-up questions or if you're looking for more resources, please feel free to send me an email. If you're interested in additional training or other webinars, or if you have an idea for a webinar, please send me an email. Again, my name is Cinnamon Porter, and my email is listed below, cporter@ywcamclean.org. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Cinnamon.